This talk really came up as a ping pong between Martin and myself. I've been complaining a lot of times to Martin about what I see as the sort of rising tide of bureaucracy within our industry, and it's always something I've wanted to talk more about. And then Martin was like, "Why don't you come and put a few more details into that?" And I'm sorry for putting on such a let's say boring subject in this sort of late afternoon. I've really tried to do a little bit to the slides so they're not as boring as they might be. As you can see, I've tried here to help or ask help from Midjourney to sort of have it come up with its idea for my front page here. This is probably what I would have. Sorry. Oh, response here. My computer is frozen. Great. Interesting. There we go. So yeah, this is probably what I would have put together myself. A rather, let's say, boring slide. But you can probably find a few familiar things in here. And essentially, I'll come back to some of those later, of course. Quickly about myself, my name is Jens Karsholm, Director of Design Technology at Bjarke Ingels Group in Copenhagen. I've been with BIG for about 5 years now. Started as a BIM manager, and I was sort of part of spearheading the implementation, or let's say re-implementation of BIM in the office, at least on the Copenhagen side. Prior to that, I also spent 3 years at Foster's, where I also helped implement BIM and Revit in the office there. I was part of the very early team of people sort of in charge of that. So essentially, I've been, and also prior to that, I had a few other roles back in Denmark, all related to BIM. But in essence, I've seen a lot of different projects at various scales, various complexity, all over the world. Because I'm typically brought in the early phases of the sort of contractual stage to sort of negotiate requirements and so on with the clients. So I at least have a fairly good idea of sort of where things are going. And maybe, to start out with, like I mentioned myself before, and when I graduated, I sort of came out of uni. My school back then was one of the first schools in Europe and maybe even in the world to fully adopt BIM workflows back in 2007. So we were only taught how to use BIM and Revit at the time. So I came out of school with this sort of almost like blind love for BIM. Like I could only see the positives, and I kept having this feeling that the more I could do, the better. And not only in the eyes of the client, but also in the eyes of my peers in the industry. Like I kind of felt like you could never say anything negative about BIM, otherwise you would be seen as a lazy guy in a way. As you can imagine, that have sort of changed over the years, and I'm now at a point where, don't get me wrong, I'm still a sort of strong supporter of BIM and a lot of the stuff around it. But there's a lot of things that sort of is built around our frameworks and so on that are becoming somewhat complicated, I would say. To a point where I keep referring to, and again, I try to use a bit of Midjourney here, but what I often refer to this sort of almost like tidal wave of requirements and things that we're coming up with. And it is literally getting to a point where you could say it's getting pretty bad, in my opinion. Obviously, it depends on what country you're building in and also what client you build for and so on. And I'm not, again, there's a sort of risk of today's talk will be, or at least I might be generalizing things a little bit, and maybe things aren't as black as white as I put it. But one of the cases, or one of the good examples, and maybe also one of the earliest things you will find when you receive a set of requirements from a client is the abbreviation list. And I'm sure a lot of you guys will probably find familiar words here, or not even words, but like acronyms or abbreviations. And I think this is one of the first examples that for me is like, why do we constantly have to come up with all these shortenings and all these, like it's almost becoming its own language in a way. And I can totally read a lot of these. I know most of these ones. There are also a few that I actually don't even know what they are supposed to mean. And I took these examples from, like everything I showed today is taken from actual examples in our office. obviously, it's been hard for me today to actually bring the examples as they are, because I don't want to hang out any clients or any projects in that sense. And the examples I brought here is just like a tiny bit of that big document I was looking into. I think the worst example I've seen was a set of requirements where we had 25 pages of acronyms and shortenings and definitions to start with before we even got started on the actual documents. So my urge to everyone here and everyone who might be listening and so on is that we stop doing all these acronyms or abbreviations, and that we actually sort of start to write things a bit more in plain language. Because if we, if project managers and senior architects and partners in charge or whatever will have to understand what we actually sign up to do, they will have to be able to read it, and not that many people are able to read all these different abbreviations. Next up, and it's almost coming as sort of along the same lines of how it would in a typical ER or a specification is the standards that we need to comply with. You might see this list here and think like, oh, I just made up like a random list of all the standards that I could think of. But this is actually taken from a real world example. We got a project in a couple of months ago where this is the actual list of standards that they required us to comply with. And as some of you might notice, there's standards that are superseding other standards. So how do you go about that? There might also be things within those standards that are actually conflicting with other parts of the standards. So I think that's an issue, and I think we're definitely seeing a trend of more and more standards coming into the market in a way, more and more standards that we have to comply with. And I think what people tend to forget sometimes is that a lot of these standards, they were created for airport projects or infrastructure projects or other things. So I think we have to get away from this sort of that we're trying to shoot sparrows with cannons, or at least that's a saying we have in Denmark. I'm sure you have something similar in the UK. And actually then at least try and specify what is it within those standards that you would like us to comply with. Because I can totally understand why you want these big standards on airports and hospitals and so on, but why do we need them on let's say a 4,000 square meter office block? It sometimes at least seems like the client or the client's BIM consultant have just copied whatever they did on the last project to the next project. Or they're trying to generate as much work for themselves as possible by writing in all sorts of pages and things that we need to deal with to really just safeguard their own ass. So in this case, I try to, of course, the question here is do we have too many standards? And don't get me wrong, I'm not against standards at all. I think standards are great. If everyone works sort of along the same lines and so on, it's totally, it's perfect. It's just not always the case. But anyways, what I try to do here is to then try and map out like, so how many pages would I actually have to read if I was to read all these through to understand what I'm signing up for this project? And as you can see, that's a lot of pages, totaling to 4,847 pages. If we then say, okay, it takes, I think it's 1 minute per 300 words. And so if we just roughly say that each of these has 300 words in each page, that would total to 80 hours of reading. And I know, again, this is making it a little bit black and white, and there might be some of them that might not have 300 words, but there's definitely others in the ISO and PAS ones that have 600 words per page. So it's maybe not completely off. This is also something I'm digging deeper into as we speak. So I might do a part 2 at some point where I'm actually doing a bit more sort of a study on the actual data behind some of these things. But essentially, again, a mid-journey interpretation of this situation. Like you can see yourself just like locked up in a room, just reading for 80 hours straight, And again, I might know the essential parts of most of those standards. There was a few that I actually didn't know before we got that project. But anyhow, I might know what they're all about. But if my project manager or partner in charge or someone else needs to understand it, it's really hard for them to actually go through this. And it's really hard for them to also just like find the time to read them and understand them in full. On top of that, and obviously this is maybe only a big problem for firms like ours and others that works very internationally, but on top of the other standards comes then the problem of every time we do a project in a new country or in a new area, there's new standards that we need to read and understand and comply with. And it's just an ever-increasing, ever-changing sort of place. So I think, again, I don't know strictly how to avoid it per se, and again, I don't think standards necessarily is a bad thing, but it's just something that I think people should acknowledge that, or at least clients and BIM consultants should consider when they put all these requirements in front of us, that a lot of this stuff takes time to read, to understand, to comply with, and to do. And quite often we're not paid extra to actually do so. Then on top of all the more official standards, typically comes an AR or a BIM specification or a BIM manual or whatever framework or however we might call it, that then dictates all the other things that we need to comply with, as you all know. And again, it's an ever-increasing thing, and it's back to the tidal wave kind of thing I talked about. That I went back to some of our projects back from 2010, 11, 12, and looked at some of those. There weren't like that many requirements and that many pages given to us back then. And then I started sort of making a few sort of checks on projects from 14 or 15 and up until today. And there's just a clear sort of, at least on our end, you might be having a different story on your end, but at least on the projects we have, there's a clear trend in just like the amount of pages that comes with these projects is only increasing. We have a very sort of tangible or concrete project where we got it in 13, and then the project went on hold. We had to renegotiate the contract. We got a new contractor on board. Client told us we're not going to change anything to the BIM requirements. You can be completely relaxed. And yet, when you looked into the document, all of a sudden it had 2 pages more than the previous document a couple of years back. And we ended up saying okay to that, and it was fine, and so on. And then, the project again went on hold. Was then renegotiated a sort of a second time, and a new third contractor came on board. And we were again told by the client, like, no, this is not going to change. This is all fine. But in the end, like, we realized that all of a sudden they had sneaked in a couple of annexes to the BIM documents, and so all of a sudden we found ourselves with a lot more pages and a lot more requirements than we actually thought we would. So it is back to that. There is just a constant increase in some of these things to a point where I think we need to push back on it. We need to see what we can do to sort of avoid that going forward. I think one of the most extreme cases we've seen was custom or like ERs or BIM requirements that would total up to 400 pages in total. And we're talking like literally just 400 pages of requirements that you need to comply with. To a point where you sit there and think like, how will we ever be able to do that? And at least the amount of time we would need to spend to actually check and make sure that we comply and that we do everything the right way, it's almost impossible. It's like how should we ever be able to pull it off? So again, I think obviously BIM consultants is playing a huge role in this, and I would urge everyone who's in that business to sort of sometimes at least reconsider a little bit what you're asking for, and also just maybe like put on a more pragmatic mindset, or at least have a bit more of a practical sense to what you're asking for, because the worst thing is when we have these sort of like people coming in with like, oh, but this might be theoretically a good idea, but I mean, we can't use that for anything. Like, it has to be practically a good idea if we need to do stuff. Another thing I think we've seen a lot recently is the rise in demands for quantities, and again, I don't want to stand up here and make it sound like I'm against quantities. I'm actually quite fond of that whole part of it in a way, as long as, again, it makes sense and it's within a realistic sort of framework. And also with the new sort of requirements around LCA and so on, the arrow around quantities has changed a little bit, or changed direction, because back in the days a lot of architects wouldn't want to do quantities because then we would be held liable for the pricing later on and so on by the contractors. Where nowadays it's actually in our best interest to have the best possible quantification because then we can have the best possible LCA output in the end. So I think there's some interesting things there. But what we've seen a couple of times is that people have these sort of unrealistic thoughts around quantities, or at least like what we can achieve with it. And they also have like this thing of not acknowledging that we actually sometimes need to work extra in order to make a model compliant, or not compliant, like but able to do the quantities in the right way, because it does require extra effort sometimes. I've seen examples of the most extreme one was a project where the client, the BIM consultant wanted us to 3D model the layer of paint in the entire building, which is you could say, okay, it's doable. If you pay us a bit extra, then we can do it. But then not only that, they wanted us to 3D model the layer of paint within the windowsill and within all the different sort of small areas of in and outs and so on, like to a point where you're like, really? And also, if we need to do that early on in the project, it's gonna just make it a lot harder for us to make changes, because every time we move stuff, we need to remove all the freaking 3D paint. So you know, it's just one of those examples. And again, I would just like to get to a point where we could trust each other a little bit more and say, okay, there is a buffer in the quantities. Everyone knows that there might be a plus minus 10% sort of, on and off. But like, instead of that we constantly sort of fight over these things, let's just like find a good sort of common ground where we can land it. I think that's another thing. Then obviously facility management is also a thing that we see more and more requirements around. Again, I'm not against it per se. I'm against doing facility management information and COBie requirements, etc. If you have a feeling that no one on the other side actually will make use of it, but it's just something that came from the BIM consultant as a safeguard. I've had various projects where when we ask the client, so can we speak to your facility management team? They're like, oh, but we haven't hired them yet, but we will do. And you end up with this feeling that sometimes some of that information might just end up on a USB stick and be put on a shelf somewhere, and then just dust away. So again, and then also related to facility management, and as well as to the quantification, what we also see a lot, especially in the last couple of years, is that we have but they have a tendency to wanting to sort of front load projects. So there's just like this, we constantly have to do things earlier and earlier and earlier on in the phases, to a point where you sometimes wonder, like, why do we need to do facility management information in schematic design? Like I can understand you need it when we hand over the building, but why do you need it? Like, why do you need COBie requirements already in SD, or sometimes even in concept almost? So again, I think I would just love if we could get back to a bit more of a pragmatic approach to some of these things. So yeah, front loading, it's really, I think, an issue at the moment. And one other thing in that relation is what we're also seeing a huge increase in is BIM and concepts. Concepts or compositions. So this, you might think that, okay, there's only, and I forgot to put in, like, obviously you can see it's years, and then this is a number of projects over there. And you might think, okay, that's only 4 or 5 projects a year, that should be doable. But this is only taken from data from our Copenhagen office. So I haven't even included the other projects from the other places we have. But as you can see here, like, literally back in 2018, we had 0 demands for BIM in competitions. And it's only gone up ever since, and to a point where, I don't know where it's going to end this year, and it might go even further up than as I put it here. And again, I can totally understand why certain clients would like to have BIM models already in the competition stage, but what they just quite often forget is that if we need to deliver a BIM model in competition stage, that means we have to maintain both a BIM model and a concept model, or at least, like, on our end, we typically work in Rhino on the concept stage, and also sometimes throughout SD. So if we need to also deliver a BIM model, that means we have to run parallel models. We also need to staff differently because we all of a sudden need to have a sort of BIM-capable person on the team as well, because not all architects is able to pull off these things. So I do think it's an sort of a thing that needs to be talked more about, or at least like, again, I'm not saying that it necessarily needs to cost a lot extra, but at least there should be an understanding from the client side that this is actually an increase in what our normal scope usually is. So again, I don't think we can necessarily fight against this, but at least I would just love if we could get to a more sort of, pragmatic mindset around it. So what can we do? It's really, I've been thinking a lot about that, and what I've done myself is, actually I'll come back to that in a second, but yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we should stop shooting sparrows with cannons as a starting point. I think if we could get to a point where we actually sort of like write it in plain language, what is it that we should do? What is it that we need to deliver? And if we need to adhere to certain standards, if we're doing a small office building, then just write what sections of those standards that you would like us to comply with, instead of just like mentioning 10 different standards in one big go to just safeguard. Because again, as I said, they're meant for big projects quite often. I would also just like, as an industry in general, that we would speak and talk more openly about some of these issues. It seems like something that everyone sort of agrees, or at least a lot of people that I've spoken to over the years agrees with, when we sit in a pub over a beer. But like we should be more vocal and more open about it on stages like this and elsewhere, to really sort of put it out there that this is an issue. And then yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we should really consider this thing about like, let's write things in plain language as much as possible. I do totally acknowledge that it is a complicated field and there's a lot of technical terms and so on, so it is hard to do it. But again, if we want to get people engaged, and if we want to get senior partners or project managers or whoever on board with some of these things, they need to be able to read the freaking documents. And as it currently is, it's really hard. It's really, really hard. And not only that, we also have this weird tendency to make LOD, like in one country it's called LOD, in the next country it's XLOD, and then in the next country it's GID, and then in the next one it's something else. And it blows my mind that we cannot come up with at least something like LOD levels, that we can't have a shared sort of definition on how to go about that. So that would be my wish. I know Marcia from Maze have talked a lot about those things in the past, and I would encourage anyone to see some of her talks on that subject as well. Also, what can I do, or what can one of you more sort of like on an individual basis do? I think one thing would be to just join your national standards committees, or maybe not the standards committees, because not every one of us have the time to sit and actually go into standards and the work that relates to standards. For instance, myself, I don't have like time on the sideline to sit and write standards and help on that end. But at least I've joined for instance, the digital task force in Denmark in the Association of Architectural Firms. I'm also sitting in on the steering committee of the implementation of the ISO in Denmark, and a couple of other things. So I'm joining those networks and committees and so on to try and influence things, and at least put my foot down every time we again try and come up with a new term or a new document or a new standard and so forth. And touching upon the ISO, for instance, I think Denmark was one of the earliest countries, at least in Europe, maybe, I don't know, maybe also in the world, to have a public mandate for BIM, which was in January of 2007. So we have a pretty good set of standards, I believe, in Denmark, or at least like some very simplistic, nice documents. And now we have the ISO coming in, and we now have to sort of change the whole framework to fit the ISO, which means that we actually have to potentially, and I'm not sort of saying any direct numbers now, but like approximately we might have to come up with like 10, 15 new documents in order to comply with what the ISO brings to the table, which that's a lot of documents when we have a well-working, fairly simple system at the moment that we've been using for quite a lot of years. But anyways, if you can, if you have the connections to get into some of these different committees and so on, by all means do so. I think it would help if there were more people who pushed the other direction. And then, yeah, use the opportunities you get to push back on things. I think that's also just a major thing. Like I would really encourage everyone. I'm sure a lot of you already do, but whenever stuff is being put on the table in front of you by a client or a BIM consultant, I would challenge stuff any day. And obviously, there's always a fear that the client might think of you as being a lazy ass, or just like trying to avoid having to do work. But that's really not the case. But at least try and push back. Try and actually challenge them on: do you actually need this? Do you need this data, or why do you need this, or is this useful for you, or why are you asking for facility management information at this point in time? Can you please explain? Or just like try and actually put out a few challenges to them, because then you will often find that actually they have no clue, or that you can at least avoid large chunks of the work. And then again, yeah, don't be afraid of voicing your opinion on this. At least that's what I've come to sort of conclude on, at least in my case, that I used to be afraid of doing so, but nowadays I'm a little bit like, I feel like we have to. So the more of you that could be inspired to do the same, I would love if that would be the case. So by all means do so. And then lastly, I mean, it's really like sort of to just conclude or wrap up, and I think we're okay on time, but it's really just to say, like, let's make sure, and going back to the whole sort of initial title of this talk, let's make sure that we just tailor the clothes of the emperor so it actually creates value to him. I think that would be the main message from me today. Like, really, as I see it, the last many years have been like we're just coming up with all sorts of stupidity that we persuade clients to think this is a great idea, we need this, I need to tick this, and the more I tick, the better project I get. And I think that might not always be the right thing, or at least that could be seen as the emperor's new clothes in a way. So cool. I hope it was light enough in the afternoon here. So and also I think we have a few minutes for questions if there is any, but I don't know. Cool. All right. Thanks, guys.